Okay, so we would like to welcome all of you very warmly to this third webinar of TurboClick, webinar series 2019, the 16th, which is plenty in total since we started in 2015. As a cross-sectoral group, we are working on the topics of localizing international agendas, inclusive cities, urban governance, financing urban infrastructure, resilient and low carbon development, capacity development methodologies, among others. The webinar series aims at exchanging experiences and good practices among our members, as well as other interested colleagues. This webinar will be about digital or ICT tools for the local implementation of global agendas. The use of information and communication technology or digital solutions that support cities becomes more sustainable is increasing at an unprecedented rate. And it's also becoming more and more visible that we really need to use digital tools to navigate the different solutions and the different things that are existing. TurboClick has just started a study aiming to compile and analyze the most relevant of the ICT or digital tools that contribute to build resilience to climate change in cities and to foster low carbon urban development, focusing on Asian cities that also contribute to the achievement of 2030 agenda and are implemented in line with the digital principles. A good methodology or concept framework has already been developed by the workstream ICT for Good Governance and implementing the 2030 agenda in Africa from the Setwork Network Good Governance Africa, in their study Digital Tools for Implementing the Sustainable Development Goals in Africa, which will also be presented in the webinar. TurboClick hopes to learn from the experience of colleagues in Asia and would also be very keen to hear further feedback and recommendations regarding the scope of the study. So now moving on to the first presentation of today. It's about Agenda 2030 meets digital principles. This will be given by Verena Goranko and Kim Schutle. I hope I've pronounced them correctly, your names. Verena is team lead for the Agenda 2030, component within the Support for Decentralization program in Ghana, and is based in Accra. Over the past years, she has been working extensively on topics around good governance, decentralization, urban and metropolitan development, digitalization, and the implementation and monitoring of the Agenda 2030. She is particularly interested in translating abstract concepts and international agendas into practical work together with municipalities. She believes in co-creation and the power of collaboration. Verena is co-leading the workstream implementing Agenda 2030 in Africa in the sector network Good Governance in Africa, together with two colleagues. Kim, who will also be presenting together this presentation, has recently joined the Fair Forward Artificial for All program as the regional focal point Africa and is based in Rwanda. Over the past years, she has been working with GIZ across Africa, including Togo, Cameroon, Uganda, and Kenya, and has specialized on digitalization and data for development. Having a degree in public policy, she is particularly interested in issues relating to good governance. Kim is co-leading the workstream ICT for Good Governance in Africa and is sector network Good Governance in Africa. The floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Charlie, for this kind introduction. So hello also from my side. My name is Verena, and as I was just introduced, I am currently working in Ghana in the program on monitoring the SDGs, which is part of the BMZ Special Initiative Program on implementing the Agenda 2030. I am coordinating the work stream implementing SDGs in Africa together with Caroline Bernecker, who's based in Benin, and Isabel Krahe, who's in Bonn in the sector program on Agenda 2030. I will start giving you some ideas on how we started with the study, and what ideas we had and what we wanted to achieve. And then also Kim will move on and give you an insight into the main highlights of our findings. So we started in the sector network GGA, Good Governance Africa, and as you might be much familiar with it, it's sometimes a bit hard also to motivate members. And so we were really looking at a topic, we're trying to find topics that are really interesting for all of our members and that are really having an impact on our daily lives. So we quickly came to the conclusion, okay, let's look at the intersection of SDGs and digitalization. We started working on that already last year. We had some first engagements also with a sector network in Latin America, REDLAC, and we even had a meeting in a joint session with them during the Fachtage, the FATA, last year in Potsdam. And then we were looking at what are the experiences from different regions, from Africa, but also from Latin America, on digitalization and SDGs. We realized that often when we now look at digital solutions, we focus on SDGs as goals. For example, we can often see we create a weather forecasting apps, and that can give better information to farmers about weather conditions. And then we say, okay, we can tick the box and say we deal with SDG 13 on climate change. We realized that this is, of course, great. I mean, it's already a good step, but we were a bit missing the whole vision and the idea and what the Agenda 2030 stands for. And then we started looking at the implementation principles, kind of like the guiding vision that is embedded within the SDGs, and go even a bit further than the individual goals. So we thought, okay, how can we now look at what is the SDGs or the Agenda 2030 as a whole, and how can we bring the digitalization topic into it? And then we found out that the work stream on ICT for good governance in Africa is doing something quite similar. So they wanted to do a research on how different projects on the ground are already working with the digital development principles. And then we said, okay, cool, maybe we can combine our two approaches. From our side, looking at the SDG implementation principles and then linking it up with the digitalization principle, or the principles for sustainable development, digital principles for sustainable development. And we knew that the SDG implementation principles were already quite established in GIZ. I mean, we talk about an integrated approach already since decades, but it's still, I think, a re-emphasized focus on it. So, I mean, the implementation principles are not something entirely new, but I think it, again, reminds us to really push a bit harder and focus more on it, because it's easy to say we want to work in an integrated way, but it's not so easy to then, in the end, really coordinate and collaborate and communicate better, even among our own projects. Then the principle of universality. How can we make sure that we learn from each other and we do not just have a solution that fits in one context, but we can also then adapt it and apply the vision of SDGs that in the end we're all developing countries. The most prominent principle, leaving no one behind. I think everybody knows about that. But also, if you look at it in detail, it's actually quite a challenge to find out who are the ones that are most left behind. Do we even have data? Do we even know about the different forms and levels of marginalization? Going hand in hand with the topic of accountability, a stronger focus on monitoring and accountability. How can we as GIZ even strengthen our support when it comes to data management, when it comes to monitoring and to working with better evidence for our own, in our own work, as well as shared responsibility? How can we better collaborate? So that's kind of like how we started. And then we said, okay, let's now try to match it, these 5 implementation principles, principles, with the 9 principles for digital development. And then our common focus is on good governance, because that's from the Good Governance Africa sector network, the focus topic all of our projects are working on, and which is also, of course, cross-cutting among all the SDGs. And we said, okay, let's try to bring these 3 dimensions together and see also how useful are these different agendas, these different guidelines and settings that are coming from either international level or also headquarters for our daily work in the projects on the ground. So which goals, which principles do we already implement, maybe even unknowingly? As I said, like the SDG principles are already quite well known, but the digital principles were still pretty new. And how can they better guide us in our planning? So one for us, like on the people who are working in the projects, but also, for example, for the planning department, the FMB. How can we make sure that these projects are actually implementing SDGs and work digitally? And how can we kill 2 birds with 1 stone? So we were wanting to come up also then with an easy-to-use checklist that is kind of like combining the essence of these 2 sets of principles and bringing it together to make sure that we really work digital as a default in our work. So we started looking at, sorry, I just saw also that question from Lucy. I hope you can see that I'm changing the slides. Yes, okay, great. Okay, so we were then trying to come up with a matching of these principles. We also had a session last year during the Republica in Ghana, where we invited a lot of people, and then we came up with some additional ideas. And one is, for example, universality. I already said that. How can we match it with the digital development principles? One is designing for scale, which I think is pretty important, because we realize that often we have some nice pilot projects, and we can come up with a nice fact sheet about it, and we put it into a report, but then it pretty much stays at a pilot level. It's often these solutions are not really being scaled up to the whole nation. How can we also be better collaborative? How can we make sure that we really foster coordination and collaboration between actors of government, different levels of government, between private sector, between civil society organizations, academia, etc. Second principle of the Agenda 2030 implementation principles, integrated approach. How can we match it with digital development principles? One is the understanding the ecosystem. Of course, you first need to know what is out there to make sure that you can then integrate it into your work. How can we promote openness? Openness in terms of technical openness and openness of data, of software solutions. The next principle, leaving no one behind, is very much going hand in hand with the whole idea of how can we really design with the user? How can we put the user in the center and not just think, okay, maybe we have some nice ideas for the marginalized women somewhere, but how can we actually involve them from the beginning in the design of the solutions? But also, how can we address privacy and security concerns? Because particularly when we speak, I don't know, for example, about a digital help center for women that were domestically abused, how can we make sure that we also protect them and make sure that this information is not going to places where it's not supposed to be? Fourth principle, shared responsibility. Of course, also looking at how can we better collaborate, as I said it already in the first principle, but also how can we make sure that we do not reinvent the wheel all the time over and over again? How can we rather reuse and improve what is already out there? And the last principle on accountability, how can we make sure also that we are really data-driven? How can we actually measure our progress? For example, in Ghana, we know that Ghana was the first country in Africa who has achieved Millennium Development Goal #1 on having a percentage of population living in poverty. Now, last year, there was a new research done, and now we found out that now more people than ever are living in poverty than before. Just because now also we change the way of measuring poverty. So how can we make sure that we really have a good understanding and a shared understanding of how we perceive progress, and how we also build for sustainability, which is also, I think, our data topic, pretty much a new challenge for GIZ, which is now having some ideas. Also, FMB is developing lots of ideas how to promote the monitoring part in GIZ work. But it's still, I think, pretty new in terms of how can we really support our partner countries and improving their monitoring systems, not our internal monitoring. So how did we go about? Well, I'm also very happy that Francois is in this call, because he was very essential in the design of this study, because he was also our main consultant. So when I'm hearing now that he will also support you in Asia in doing the activities that you're planning for, I'm already very happy, because we made very positive experiences with him. So we looked also at what is already out there. How can we not repeat what has been done already? So we looked at a project database that was developed by the sector program on digital development, and they have compiled a list of digital projects all around the globe. And then we were basically searching for 3 keywords. One was ICT, then was governance, and Africa. We had 65 digital solutions in total, and then we selected some where we thought, okay, that's interesting. They have different levels of development already in terms of the solutions. Some are just starting, some have already been worked on for quite a while. And we were starting to do some interviews, did some research, and analyzed the data, consulted the people again. And then we were trying to come up with some conclusions and key findings that could then be put into the we called it checklist, and in the end, and the key recommendations. And we looked at 5 projects in detail. That was Mauritania, Cameroon, Kenya, Benin, and Ghana, where we saw, okay, there is different levels of development already. Of course, we have different we wanted to have a geographical balance. And we, of course, also needed people who were really committed and willing also to participate in this research. So we were then trying to come up with, okay, how can we link the digital topic with the SDGs and have a critical assessment of how the projects look like right now. So also being a bit honest, not just showcasing everything is easy and super fine and we already implement all the principles equally. And now Kim will then give you some more insights into what we actually found out, where we saw challenges and what is working well already from our side. Please, Kim.
Yeah, thank you, Verena. I hope you can hear me well. My name is Kim and I'm currently based in Rwanda. I recently joined a new global project on artificial intelligence, which is called Fair Forward and is active in 5 countries across Africa and Asia. So India is also included. And as was already introduced as well, I am co-leading the workstream ICT for Good Governance in Africa in the sector network GGA with my colleagues Hamza, who is based in Mauritania, and Emil Lando, who is based in Cameroon. So I would like to give you a brief overview of what we actually found out with this study, and I hope that it will be a good basis for what you are trying to work on then in your sector network. So basically here what you can see is just a brief capture of how this study looks like. So what was done is to basically have a 1 page per project that was assessed and then put together some key information for each of these projects. And in the annex of the study, you can also find more detailed information based on the different principles and really have in detail information there. So we're going to share this with you after the webinar so that you can also have a look. But what I want to focus on now is just some general conclusions of what we've found assessing the different projects in Africa. So What you can see here is the 9 digital principles, and then the 5 projects that were assessed in the different countries. And you can see how well the principles were implemented in each of these projects. So green basically means it was very well implemented. Orange means there's still some work to do. Red means it was not well implemented yet. And you can also see some gray dots, which is basically that there was not enough information in order to assess this. But I think it gives us a quite good overview of how the different projects implement the digital principles. First of all, what we can say is that very few of these projects actually actively or consciously implemented the digital principles, which I think could be explained by the fact that they were still quite new at the time we were doing the interviews, and that many people have already started implementing the digital solutions. So there wasn't enough time to actually consciously think about these principles and implement them. But what is actually quite interesting is that you still see a lot of green dots on this map or overview. And this shows us that many of the principles are actually implemented quite unconsciously already in our projects. Especially this is the case when we look at design with the user and understand the ecosystem, which was quite well implemented in many of the projects. And we thought about an explanation for this, or why this could be. And what we came up with is that these principles are actually already quite well implemented into our GIZ processes and tools. Like if we think about capacity works, for example, and we look at understand the ecosystem, then we will quite surely think about the stakeholder map or the map of actors. So I think these are already principles we are working with on a daily basis. And secondly, they're also not only applicable to digital solutions, because when we think about design with the user and understand the ecosystem, we really need that for all solutions or all activities that we are implementing. So this is quite intuitive for us, I think. On the other hand, you see that some of the principles further below on the list have not been so well implemented, and this is especially the case for the use of open standards, open data, open source, and open innovation, so the openness principle, and also the privacy and security principle. And what is interesting with these is that they are really applicable to digitalization and to digital tools. So they're quite new for us, and we first need to find mechanisms to really work with these and make sure that we implement them. Secondly, it's quite difficult in many partner countries to implement these principles when there are no frameworks in place to do this. For example, there are not many countries in Africa yet who have a data protection policy in place. And if this legal framework is not there, then we need to make a much bigger effort in order to implement this well in this particular country. The same is the case with the openness, because you first need the infrastructures for this in place before you can really also convince partners that this is a good idea. What we found as well is that many partners sometimes are skeptical of open source solutions because they are obviously worried about data protection and other things that this might imply. So I think there needs to be a discussion about this before we can really actively implement this, and we really need to advocate more for doing so. Then, if we move to the Agenda 2030 implementation principles, it looks much more positive, I would say. And what is important to mention as well is that these principles were implemented in a much more conscious way, because everybody will have heard about leave no one behind. I think you can't find a single person in the development sector who hasn't heard of that. Also, accountability is a key principle of the governance sector. And as we focused on good governance, I think that was also a principle that was key in the projects that were being assessed. So this is a much more conscious choice to implement, but obviously there are also challenges, as Verena already mentioned. I just want to highlight a few of them. For example, if we look at universality, we found out that a lot of projects are developing quite nice digital solutions, but only in a pilot project stage. So the challenge is often to scale these solutions at the national level or even at the regional level. And if we don't think about this from the beginning, like the design for scale principle, this can be quite challenging. So I think here is definitely something we need to think about more, to actually not only develop pilot solutions, but solutions that are actually useful to scale at a broader level. And then if we look at the integrated approach, this is also something that I think many of us want to implement, but it's quite hard because there are so many different interests of different actors in the ecosystem, especially when we're working with the private sector, that even if there is a will to have an integrated approach and also to work together, it's not always easy to combine the different interests of the different actors. So this was just a very brief overview. You can ask more questions after the presentation about this. But I want to quickly show you as well the checklist that we came up with, which basically summarizes in 8 key points what we need to take into account when developing a digital solution. And these points are basically derived on what is not yet working very well. So it focuses on a lot on the privacy and security aspects and on the other things that we thought we need to focus more on. So this actually breaks down this huge list of digital principles and explanations to a simple checklist that can be used in an easy way by people who want to develop a digital solution. And then after this, so we're still working on this because the study was just a first step, basically. And after the study, we were thinking about what can we actually do with this now in order to make it useful for all of us and other colleagues within GIZ and beyond GIZ. So what we've been doing so far is to disseminate the results of the study within GIZ and also beyond GIZ. We, for example, had an exchange with the Digital Impact Alliance, DIAL, who is actually working on a similar project, matching SDGs with digital principles, and they were quite interested in exchanging on this and thinking about how to use our results for their study. We're also still thinking about using and refining the tools, for example, the checklist. So how can we actually work more on this and make it better, improve it, make it more useful for the colleagues working on digital solutions. And then the third one is we were thinking about to actually pick 1 or 2 of these principles, for example, the ones that were not so well implemented, and dig deeper into these and try to find out what we can actually do in order to implement these principles in a practical way within GIZ. So these are first ideas, but we're actually really open to discuss this and to see what else would be useful for you and what we could do with this study, and also to exchange further in your process of working on this ICT study. These are our contact details, also those of our colleagues. And thank you very much for listening to this presentation. And I think we will still be here to answer some questions if you have some. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you, Verena. I think till Lucy uploads the other presentation, maybe we could take a couple of questions. So there's one already that's here from Felix, and he's saying, are these minimum standards or an ideal? Does any of the implemented projects tick all boxes?
Yeah, it's a good question. So you're referring to the checklist, I guess, and this checklist has basically been developed based on what was not working well. So no, none of the projects has ticked all the boxes yet, but in an ideal world we would tick all the boxes. And I think it should be minimum standards, but it will still be very hard for a project to tick them all. So there's still some way we need to go until doing so.
I have one question as well. In your filtration, you used ICT as one of the filter terms, no? I know of several projects which don't specifically mention ICT but have digital. Did you also look at that as one of your filters, or was it only ICT?
No, I would say we looked at digital topics in a broader sense. So also, I mean, some projects are more pronounced on it, but some are somehow working with digital solutions. So we were trying to look at whatever is somehow digital and cluster that in our work.
Okay, so then basically covering everything. Okay,
Yeah.
that sounds good. Yeah, very nice presentations, I must say, and very, very informative. Of course, I think we are all struggling with the same fact that things are sometimes rather hidden and not really as visible for looking at digital ideas and specifically looking at digital systems. But there are a lot of projects that are still already using this as one of the digital tools. So 65 is a big number, if I must. So you really filtered through all the 65 projects and then went through the whole system. That's fantastic. So any other questions? Okay, so if not, then I'll invite Francois. I'm sorry, I'm not really very good at pronouncing your name. So Francois is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Center for Research on Evaluation, Science and Technology, CREST, Stellenbosch University. His areas of interest include higher education studies, critical data and technology studies, and scholarly communication. He is also a consulting researcher at SBC4D and editor and trustee of the not-for-profit open access book publisher African Minds. Francois holds a PhD in Science and Technology Studies from Stellenbosch University. Past research has included studies on openness and social inclusion, on the use of technology according to the Digital Development Principles, on intermediaries and open data use, on the flows of data, among others. Francois, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Vaishali. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. I'm not sure where everyone is based, but I'm sure that covers everyone. Verena and Kim have done a great job in setting up the context for what we're embarking on in this project. It makes my life a lot easier in this presentation, and I'll try and go fairly quickly so that we have time for questions, and we particularly would value your input, particularly in terms of the selection of projects, which I'll get to as we work through the presentation. So, first of all, I'm not entirely sure how familiar everyone is with the study, and I haven't given a lot of background context, so apologies if that's missing. I'll jump straight to the goals of what we're trying to achieve, and these come directly from the terms of reference The only thing that I've added here is to cluster them into four groups, just to make it a little bit simpler to understand what the objectives of the study are. So in the first instance, what we'd really like to do is give an overview of what is happening in the landscape. So what kinds of digital tools and projects are currently being undertaken, and try and map those and provide some insight into the scale and the focus of these particular tools. So this is a slight departure from the previous study that Kim and Verena presented, in the sense that here we're not just going to simply go to 4 or 5 studies and do a more deeper analysis. We're also interested to see what the broader picture looks like. I think the focus will be on Asia, and you'll see when we come to the selection criteria, but it's not only on Asia. I think at this level we'd like to include projects from around the world to get a better sense of what's happening. The second part is to implement or assess these projects against the digital development principles. I mean, you're fairly familiar with the principles now following the previous presentation. Here we would select a few cases to evaluate, probably 10 or 12 cases. Important to mention, I added the word that these projects have not only been guided by, but also that these principles are present in the studies. And the importance there is, again, mentioned in the previous presentation, that some of the projects that we'll look at may not have been designed or initiated with the digital principles in mind, but may nevertheless be including some of those principles in the way that they operate. We account for that in some way in the study by indicating the maturity of the project. So you would have seen in that traffic light assessment in the previous study that some studies may have had grey boxes or red or orange boxes, and we were quite explicit to mention the fact that those might be because the projects are in very early stages. So it's not an indication that those projects have simply ignored those principles, but that they had not really implemented them yet, and that may change over time. So assessing a project in year 1 may not look the same as an assessment of a project in year 5 or 3 or 7, depending on the length of the implementation. And then the third part is to assess the projects against the 2030 agenda, as well as the digital principles, to end up again with a similar kind of scoring mechanism to see if we can detect any patterns and learn anything from what we see. Try and create some generalizations. Of course, those are always a little bit dangerous, but they do provide you some insight for further exploration. And then the last one, which is equally important, is to promote the exchange of these tools and learnings. It was interesting working on the previous project. What I often found as an outsider interviewing people that were working on the GIZ project is that they sometimes undervalued some of the products and tools, and not the formal products or tools, but even some of the reports or methodologies developed in the projects, and didn't really value the value that they would create for other people outside of GIZ, or even within GIZ but working in different areas. And so that's something that I think is worth keeping in mind as we do this assessment and go through this process. So I'm not going to spend any time on the conceptual framework because that's been presented in quite a lot of detail already. What I'm going to focus on instead is how we intend to approach the study. So I'm going to present a series of steps, and this is the first of those steps. Obviously, we need a set of categories or fields for specific data that we're interested in collecting on each project, and that's the first step that we're working on at the moment. On the left-hand side of the slide, you can see the kinds of fields that we've thought of including. Here again, your input would be very valuable. I mean, if you had to think from your own needs, if you wanted to search through a future database of projects in this area, what particularly would you be interested in? Is there anything that's missing from this list? If there is, we'd be very keen to know and could certainly include that. Always much easier to include that, obviously, at the beginning than to have to go back at the end and repopulate a database for a missing field. So the information is fairly simple: the name of the tool, a short description, the purpose. I mean, they don't all share a common purpose. There are different purposes, even from the initial analysis that I've done. That's quite obvious. The city, because we're interested in cities in particular in this study. Country, region, we want to include both GIZ and non-GIZ projects, so I thought to include a way of filtering those. Whether it's linked to a project, it's not always the case, but it may be the case, or to an organization. Quite important is to have a URL if it is a digital tool. Not all tools are necessarily online, but many would be. And to be able to click on that URL and see the product for oneself is always useful. And then a contact details for whoever may be the main contact for the development or implementation of that tool. The status, which is something I added towards the end because I realized how many of the tools were developed and no longer function. And that might be slightly depressing, but might also tell us something about why that might be the case. Verena and Kim spoke about the sustainability criterion or principle in the 9 principles. And if that is indeed a principle that we want to strive for, then tools being up and running for a year or two and then disappearing raises questions about sustainability. I'll go on to the next slide. So how are we going to find projects to include in the database? Well, we have several sources. There's a digital pathfinder in GIZ that we can consult. There's the Let's Talk Digital report, which showcases several reports in this area. And then the main source of data would be the project database that we've now already had the first look at. And we've identified 566 tools that may be relevant at a fairly high level. So those would all be within GIZ. From outside of GIZ, obviously we can do web searches to identify tools, but also even more useful would be recommendations by colleagues and experts. I've already started sending out some emails and asking people to suggest any projects that they think should be included. And again, that's where we would ask for any input from participants on this call that may think, I have a project that I really want to include, or there is a good source of projects that you should consult to see whether they would be worthwhile including in your analysis. So we spoke a little bit in the previous project about how we went about narrowing the field down to relevant projects. So I've included on the right there some of the steps that we've already started to take from the database. So we filtered first by continent, because we're interested in cases from Asia, then by country. I mean, in the database, Asia is quite a broad category, and I think our interest is mainly in Southeast Asia plus China. So we would exclude countries like Lebanon or Palestine or Armenia from that list. So from filtering purely for Asia, we would reduce the list down to 285. And then for the specific countries in Southeast Asia and China, we get down to 232. In the database, there are many sector fields. There's sector 1 and then subsectors for sector 1, sector 2, and subsectors, again, subsections for sector 2. If we look across all those fields and we filter for climate relevant projects, we get down to 60. The next step that I'm busy with at the moment is to read through the project descriptions for those 60 projects and then further narrow the selection. Because even within these broad categorizations, not all of them will be relevant to the specific focus of this project. How we're going to do the assessment once we've narrowed the field down is to select a final list of, say, 10 to 15, maybe 12 projects, and then do a similar analysis to what we did in the previous project, but probably a much lighter touch, in the sense that instead of doing in-depth interviews and ending up with 3 or 4 projects that we do a very in-depth analysis, we'd rather have more projects and have an initial assessment of those projects. So for that reason, we'll be relying mainly on secondary sources rather than on interviews, which are obviously more time-consuming, but also more difficult to get people to commit their time. And it is quite a time-onerous process of being interviewed, and then their follow-up questions that inevitably emerge. So we've decided in this case to take this approach. We'll still end up with the same kind of scorecard, if you were, per project, as I've illustrated there for Mauritania in this case. But as I said, it will be a much lighter touch. And as an output, we'd like to produce a map. It'll be a more detailed map than this because we'll have more projects. We won't just include the ones that are assessed, but all the projects to give a sense of the landscape, as I said earlier, and produce presentation materials, a report and or a PowerPoint presentation with possibly some interactive functionality to make accessing and understanding the results as easy as possible. So I've gone fairly quickly because I think there are 10 minutes left, and I'm really hoping that there would be some questions and suggestions for how to improve not only the approach but also the selection of projects in our analysis. Thank you, Vaishali.
Thank you so much. I have a question. I have two. One for the audience, in case you have some questions, please put it already in the chat box. And the second then for Francois from my side. So in your approach, when you are saying Umwelt and Klima, are you also looking at the projects from the governance side, or is it only environment and climate related projects?
Well, in this, I'm not muted. In this first analysis, we've not included the governance projects. Of course, we could go back and re-include them, and that's where feedback would be useful. If you're aware that, you know, in the categorization there might be important projects that have been categorized under governance, then we would have to go back and look at those projects too.
Yeah, I would suggest that, because my project, that's the Climate Smart Cities project, is under the governance sector network. Okay, there's also this ICTA adaptation for climate change, which is a global project. It's also under the governance. There's also Cities Fit for Climate Change, that's also under the governance, and all of them are using some form or the other of digital methodologies. So it would be good if you could also look at them.
That's fine. Thank you. That's really useful. It won't change the process. It'll just mean we start with a slightly bigger
just
sample.
Your base would need some more projects to be added on. That's all.
Yeah, that's fine. We can certainly do that.
And if I may, sorry, just one more thing. So would you also be mapping then? Because it would be fantastic to just see. Maybe as a list, or maybe just as locations, as points, when you are saying, okay, you had 285, which we narrowed down to 235, and then you narrowed down to 60. Mm-hmm. But also just the locations, maybe the countries, or so somewhere there could also be visually depicted. It would be fantastic.
Yeah, so the idea is, I mean, as you said, at the moment we're at 60, that would go down. As I read the descriptions, they're not all going to be relevant, so that number will reduce, but because we're going to add in governance, it'll go back up again. So it's hard to say at this stage how many we'll end up with until we've gone through that process. But certainly the idea is, once we've been through that process, is to represent these visually on a map.
Okay.
And then we would indicate which of those we've actually gone and done a more detailed analysis. So of those, let's say there are 50 for argument's sake, and we've selected 12, would indicate on the map, for these 12, click here, and then go and look at the assessments for those 12. And those 12 would obviously be in Asia, whereas the map would be global.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Sounds good.
What I quickly wanted to add would be the idea, maybe if the keyword search, because now looking on the explanation from Verena and Kim, how they did on their study, they had like this 3 keywords, and I'm not sure, I mean, looking at the database as it is, it's quite nicely easy to look at these sectors, also to filter the projects in the sectors, but maybe also to, after that, also have a keyword search on like adaptation and mitigation, so that we also see, okay, if these are the additional projects that were not in the filtering, maybe, because the focus is here really like projects looking at the mitigation and adaptation in the urban sector, so that we really have this key projects also in there in the global perspective, but then also to look, okay, what is there in the Asia context. And one quick remark, Francois, maybe on the descriptions, on the categories that you have suggested for the database. I'm not sure if it's possible to differentiate the type of tool. If it's a tool for what does the tool does? If it's a forecast, or if it's I don't know what kind of different categories we could include there. It's the purpose. It could be the purpose, but I also like if it's the just the type of tool. Also, if it's a website, or if it's something that is also not yet online, or it's something digital but not online, so that this differentiation. And also maybe the year. When you look at the status, maybe the year of development, so that we have a little bit of the overview of when the tools have been developed so far, if this information is available. But these were the comments I had just initially, and we are still then in contact furthermore. But idea is to actually ask the colleagues and use the opportunity that we have the colleagues here to ask for their feedback and recommendations and any comments. So feel free, everybody, to pose questions.
Yeah, if I could just add, I think we could certainly add a type. What we need is a good typology, and that's always difficult when you start, because we don't know what we're going to encounter, and you know, if there's something ready-made, it's always useful as a starting point. I can share it now or via email at a later point, but we're starting with quite a diverse set of tools, and so in a way the typology might be an output rather than something that we know from the beginning. You know, for us to know all the types.
Let me think about it, and then we can exchange further. I might come with some suggestions as well. But as everybody seems that they have to run to other meetings as well. Let's see if there are any other urgent issues from the colleagues.
So there's a question. It says, what's the time frame for the study, and when we would be able to share it, share the results from this analysis?
So we are hoping to conclude the analysis in the month of January, so early next year. And I would imagine after some internal discussions and checking, Lucy, correct me if I'm wrong, but by February I would imagine something more final. But I'm hoping we'd also consult during the process, so this wouldn't be the only opportunity for others to give input before the product is finalized.
No, we can try to arrange some other loops also to get more feedback in between, at least also from our colleagues from the region. But yeah, we will. Everybody who wants to keep informed and also give feedback in the meantime, we are happy to include in further exchange loops.
Yeah, and I would also suggest that maybe in the next virtual meeting, instead of the webinar, we could present the study in the virtual meeting and get feedback. So February is when we are looking at, so that would be ideal, I suppose.
No, for sure. But yeah, from my side, thanks a lot already, Francois, for the work and for the structure and the ideas that you have developed so far, and we are still then in coordination and communication, and we will also find a way of reaching out to certain colleagues in case we need more information on certain products or solutions that we find out are the ones that we want to analyze further. So this is the process now for us to fine tune the analysis and look at the 10 to 12 projects that we will look in more detail, and also then to contact the colleagues for further exchange. or for further information requests, so to say.
Okay, so if there are no more questions, then I would say thank you so much, Verena, Kim, and Francois. And it was really very interesting, the tools that you presented and the study that you did in Africa. And we look forward then to be in touch, and we will circulate these presentations as well as the link and the webinar recording to the larger group as well as on EDA. Thank you so much, and look forward to the next webinar in February. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.